Sometimes faith in progress can be so overwhelming that the world is willing to go to any lengths to ensure a new technological leap forward, regardless of the threat it may present to both mankind and his environment. At the beginning of the 1920s, the leading American oil and automobile industry added lead to gasoline to obtain a more efficient fuel. At that time, lead was already a known poison, harmful to the nervous system, especially of children. However, lead quickly won over the use of other less harmful additives, and profits within the oil industry soared for decades to come. But hundreds of thousands of tons of lead were spread around the world, causing injuries such as impairing the IQ of millions. Lead from gasoline has literally made a lot of us a little more dim.
Gasoline. Powerful stuff. Modern magic. Our lives, our business, our cities are patterned on motor transportation which gasoline has made possible.
Nothing has had such a profound impact on the development of society in the 20th century as the motor car. During a few decades, the car has become mankind's preferred means of efficient transport, to which our streets and highways bear witness more and more the world over. Right from its early beginnings, our enthusiasm for the car and its qualities has simply never ceased.
It was that wonderful day not so long ago when the automobile first came to an American town. The youngsters swarmed excitedly after man's latest mechanical marvel. Adventurous riders held tight as the contraption careened crazily along, sending into frightened flight horses which had served their masters so well and so long.
With the rapid spread of cars, the production of fuel quickly became a very lucrative industry. At the beginning of the century, cars ran on anything which could turn over a combustion engine to propel a four-wheeled vehicle.
There was an abundance of them. You could get benzene from coal, you could get other kinds of synthetic gasolines, and you could make alcohol from farm crops. For example, France, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, England, Poland, all these other countries were using blends of alcohol. Now that was considered to be the universal choice of the future, but it was a little bit more expensive than oil.
Competition between suppliers of the most popular fuel, gasoline and alcohol, was tough, and the car manufacturers were competing for faster and more efficient cars, which drove on the relatively expensive fuel. New high compression engines were developed, but the automobile industry ran into problems with their new engines due to their irregular combustion, which caused knocking. Then General Motors, who were producing the well-known brands Chevrolet and Cadillac, discovered that fuel was the problem, so the industry invested large amounts of money in raising the octane level.
The General Motors research effort was headed by Thomas Midgley, and he tried something like 15,000 different combinations of elements. They did find that benzene from coal would work. They did find that alcohol from farm crops would work. So you could add 10% alcohol to gasoline and get a higher quality fuel, less knocking in the engine.
In 1920, Thomas Midgley took out a patent on a mixture of refined benzene and 30% alcohol. And in October of 1921, at a meeting of motor engineers, he told participants that the alcohol mixture had incredible advantages, such as pure combustion without the emission of soot, and in addition, fuel combustion gave more horsepower without engine knocking. But Thomas Midgley continued with his research and, within a few months, made a new discovery.
It was discovered that a rare compound of lead, mixed in proper proportions with gasoline, made an ideal anti-knock fuel. Horsepower increased, speed picked up, and the knock was gone.
No man can look at the amazing record of accomplishment here in this research division without confidence that these men are going ahead with an eye to the future, looking for new facts and principles which will make things better and make life easier for all of us.
In 1923, Midgley writes to his boss, Charles Kettering at GM from Florida. He's on vacation because he's actually got lead poisoning from all the research. And he says, can you imagine how much money we're going to make with this? We're going to make $200 million, maybe more.
The oil industry was even more carried away by this discovery, and the biggest American oil company, Standard Oil, together with General Motors, created a joint corporation, TEL Corporation, and built huge factories for the manufacture of the lead additive tetraethyl lead.
Why pick leaded gasoline over alcohol if they both did the same thing? Well, leaded gasoline was far more profitable. For one thing, if you add a large percentage of alcohol into gasoline, you've lost the petroleum sales. So you've lost 10, 15%, maybe 20% of your market right there. Whereas if you add leaded gasoline, you've got a product that you control, you, the oil industry, control. That's what they wanted.
Lead is an old and well-documented poison. As early as the year 100 BC, it was common knowledge in ancient Rome that lead could cause insanity and eventually incur death.
The Romans tried to protect the slaves that worked in the silver mines where they were exposed to lead from the dust by giving them crude masks to prevent them from inhaling too much dust. This is 2,000 years ago. And so we knew that lead was poisonous. What happened over the years was that we started to appreciate that lead toxicity could occur at lower and lower concentrations.
Lead is one of the best known poisons in history. It was a well-known occupational poison in the industries of France and England and Germany in the Industrial Revolution. And in the United States, it was a well-known industrial poison. So when Standard Oil and General Motors wanted to use it in gasoline, public health officials were very, very concerned. They couldn't imagine why anybody would want to do a thing like this.
In the autumn of 1922, the general manager of the American Health Department asked General Motors for an estimation of the health impact of using lead in gasoline. At that time, General Motors hadn't studied the question that closely and offered to finance an investigation. And the American Ministry of Mining, recognizing the sensitivity of the matter and showing great understanding for some of the sponsors' demands, agreed to word their findings.
General Motors Corporation specifically asked the U.S. Bureau of Mines not to refer to the study as a leaded gasoline study, to simply not use the word lead. So they would use a substitute word. They would use the word which was the name of their product, which was ethyl. Now, ethyl is a woman's name, and it's a very nice name for a woman. My grandmother was named Ethel. So they called it ethyl gasoline, but in fact it was leaded gasoline. And the point was to move the attention away from lead.
But it was difficult to draw attention away from lead when, for those factory workers producing tetraethyl lead, the substance already had a bad reputation.
Loony gas means something that drives you crazy. And that's what the workers called it, because they knew that working in this particular part of the refinery was very dangerous. In the DuPont facility down in Deepwater, somebody had scrawled an enormous butterfly on the side of the wall to represent that this was the house of butterflies, because what was happening was the workers saw butterflies that weren't there. They were hallucinating because the poison was so malicious.
During the autumn of 1924, more and more reports were published about workers growing ill, and on October the 27th, the New York Times printed an article about a Mr. McSweeney who felt ill after coming home from work. The newspaper wrote that early next morning his sister-in-law rang the police because he was acting irrationally, and a patrolman was sent to the house to question him. It ended with the patrolman having to enlist the aid of 3 other men to subdue McSweeney and take him to the Alexian Hospital, where he was put into a straitjacket. The same day, the newspaper reported that another employee, a Mr. Dimmock, had, according to family members, woken in the middle of the night and walked out of his second-story bedroom window.
When Standard Oil Company opened its tetraethyl lead plant in 1924, they had created a process so hazardous that within a month of opening operations, 5 people died violently insane, and another 45 or so were severely injured by the worst lead poisoning any of the coroners or doctors had ever seen. This caused an enormous outcry. People said, how the heck did that happen? And when they find out that the same substance is being put in their gasoline and they didn't even know it, then there is a call for a government investigation.
In many cities such as New York, Philadelphia and Washington, the sale of leaded gasoline was forbidden. And some months later, the Surgeon General, Hugh Cumming, invited both the industry and independent experts to a conference. The industry was well represented, and Frank Howard from Standard Oil delivered an impassioned speech. "A continued development of motor fuels is essential for our civilization," he declared, and later in praising lead, he referred to it as a gift from God. The conference was planned to last 4 days because many of the participants wanted time to debate alternatives to lead. But the Surgeon General closed the conference after a single day, and 6 months later the health authorities concluded that there are no good grounds for prohibiting the use of ethyl gasoline, and the ban was subsequently lifted. It seemed that all warnings were simply being ignored. One such warning came from Yandell Henderson, who foresaw exactly what would be happening in our own time these 40 years later. Alongside automobile thoroughfares, the atmosphere might be polluted to such an extent that those who worked or lived in close proximity to such streets would gradually absorb sufficient quantities of lead to be poisoned by it. A number of prominent industrialists and inventors maintained that alcohol was still preferable to lead.
Henry Ford was convinced that alcohol was the fuel of the future. He wanted to see alcohol fuel a rural renaissance. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, advocated it, and a number of other famous inventors at the time were all in favor of using alcohol as an octane booster.
The producers of alternative fuel attempted to market their products as safe and non-poisonous, but were stopped.
The resistance to leaded gasoline disappeared, partly because there was a Federal Trade Commission order in the United States that banned any negative advertising about leaded gasoline. So if you were selling a competitive product, you couldn't say that leaded gasoline was poisonous.
By the beginning of the 1930s, the battle was as good as lost, for by then, more than 90% of American cars used leaded gasoline.
Ethyl brand of anti-knock compound has helped the petroleum industry to bring out better and better gasoline. Faster, smoother, more resilient power. On the highway, on the farm, in the air, and on the water. For this is the age of motor transportation, with gasoline for everybody.
The oil industry now turns against the European market, where the alcohol-mixed gasoline is still dominating, and the industry gets help from the American health authorities.
The Public Health Service actually marketed leaded gasoline in Europe on behalf of Ethyl Corporation and Standard Oil. They actually went out and said, there's no problem with this stuff, why aren't you using it? In the National Archives, there's a file full of letters that were sent by the Surgeon General to the heads of public health services of various countries, Switzerland, France, Great Britain, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, all over the world. The letters basically said, we've done a study, we found there's no problem, you should feel free to use this in your own country. I'll be glad to share the study with you.
It came also with the blue stamp from the U.S. Public Health Service. So it came with the best possible recommendations, and it was very clear that it had great technological advantages. And Europe was not prepared to do any sort of prepare any second opinion in that regard. And it took many years before Europe started thinking independently along these lines.
The sheer number of cars exploded both in the USA as well as in Europe. The alcohol alternative was slowly outnumbered, and thousands of tons of lead spread out into the environment. And several years would pass before leaded gasoline would once again be a talking point, when one day in the middle of the 1960s, an American scientist made a shocking discovery.
Claire Patterson was working at Caltech University and was trying to establish the age of the Earth, and was using isotopes of lead in order to do that. And as he worked, he realized that his laboratory was so contaminated by lead, and he wasn't really even sure where at first, that he was getting bad readings.
Claire Patterson did a study of the inland ice on Greenland, where they had drilled a core of ice, and then they just examined slices of this ice core representing different times of human history. And by doing that analysis, Claire Patterson was able to show that the prehistoric lead concentration in Greenland were extremely low. And he could actually show that the Roman use of lead caused an increased pollution in Greenland. And then came the Industrial Revolution and caused another increase. And a huge increase then happened after the Second World War, when the production of tetraethyl lead simply skyrocketed. And all of that lead polluted every corner of the world. Every human being in the world was full of industrial lead.
Last year, some of the animals in New York's Staten Island Zoo were poisoned. A few died. Others, including this black leopard, became paralyzed. Whatever the poison was, it came from the environment, and it was strong enough to do permanent damage to the black leopard's nervous system. Blood tests showed that the poison was lead. This news was so startling, the doctors expanded their study to other animals living in outdoor cages in other city zoos.
According to Dr. Chow, who we've sent samples to, the levels are so high, he didn't believe the animals were alive.
The lead poisoning the zoo animals comes from leaded gasoline. Automobiles put 200,000 tons of toxic lead into our urban environment every year. It's too much for the animals to take.
These are dangerous conditions, not only for the animals who are living in the confinement of the zoo, but of the people who are also living in the close neighborhood or even come there just as visitors.
In America, air pollution caused by emission from cars became an urgent problem. And in the beginning of the 70s, a so-called catalytic converter was introduced, reducing the emission of dangerous gases. But catalytic converters don't work if the gasoline contains lead. So America introduced unleaded gasoline as early as 1972, and after a few years, the quantity of lead present in human blood fell considerably. However, lead already absorbed by the body doesn't just disappear. It resides in our bones, nails and teeth. Yet people didn't seem to grasp this fact until Professor Herbert Needleman began his pioneering investigation into the lead content of babies' teeth.
Since lead washes out of the blood but stays in the teeth, Needleman had an idea. He got 2 entire school districts near Boston to send him every baby tooth which popped out of every first or second grader. Needleman then ran intelligence tests on the students with the greatest and least amounts of lead in their teeth.
And we found that children who had higher lead in their teeth but no signs of toxicity had lower IQ scores, poorer attention, poorer language function. The average IQ in my low lead group was 6 points higher than that in my high lead group. The number of children in the low lead group who had IQs below 80 was 4%. The mean IQ below 80 in the high lead group was the fate of 16%. So there was a 4-fold increase in low IQ associated with lead. In addition, the highest IQ in my high lead group was 125. The highest IQ in my low lead group was 143. 5% of the children were deprived of having superior function because of lead exposure. That turns out to be about 875,000 American children who could be very bright but are not because of lead exposure.
Needleman's investigations caused great concern amongst parents, not only in America but also in Europe, and precautionary moves were set in motion so that by the beginning of the 1980s, European countries also began reducing the quantity of lead in gasoline until eventually unleaded gasoline was introduced. As in America 10 years earlier, the lead content in human blood was now swiftly decreasing across Europe. But at the end of the 1980s, Professor Needleman made an even more shocking discovery.
12 years later, I realized that the subjects in my study were adults. And so with the help of my colleagues in Boston, we were able to find half of them and bring them back in and test them. And we found that having high lead in your teeth in 1976 was associated with a 7-fold increase in failing out of high school. If you had high lead in your teeth in 1976, you were 7 times likely not to graduate from high school than if you had low lead in your teeth. The impact of that study was that lead exposure effects are permanent and they're expressed in real-life performance.
You can easily survive with 1 kidney. You don't need both kidneys, essentially, but you certainly need as much of your brain as you can keep. And just the ban of lead in petrol in the United States has been shown to have beneficial effects that correspond to billions and billions of dollars per year, simply because of the better academic success of the children who are now exposed to much lower levels of lead during their development, so that they can contribute more to the economic success of the society. And if you're talking about a whole population, a whole country, actually the whole world, this single substance, tetraethyl lead, has had tremendous implications, tremendous adverse effects on the economy of the world.
By the end of the 1990s, lead was as good as phased out throughout Europe, and a number of developing countries followed suit. But not in Africa, where huge quantities of leaded gasoline are still being used. In South Africa, for example, where large concentrations of lead can still be found in the bloodstreams of children and adults.
At the community level, lead is a major problem for South Africa. We reduce the number of children who would have exceptionally high IQ and who might be the entrepreneurs and leaders in our communities. Although we are trying to do whatever we can to make sure that children are no longer exposed to lead, the legacy of lead amongst children in Africa will continue. And for women especially, when they fall pregnant in the future, there is the risk also that a lot of lead will cross the placenta and also cause exposure in the baby. So their growing babies could still have high levels of lead in their blood because of what the mother was exposed to in her childhood.
Even though many African countries have now phased out leaded gasoline, the presence of lead and its damage will still exist for many years to come, perhaps even for generations. It took, all in all, around 80 years from the introduction of lead until it was finally banned. Now, in many countries around the world, lead has at last been replaced with the old and well-known alternative, alcohol, as it already could have been, way back then.
It seems to me that it's ironic that we end up with ethanol now as a major answer, not the only answer, but as one of the big answers to the fuel problem and the anti-knock problem in a way that was perfectly obvious to people in the 1920s.